Hello everyone, Reza here. Welcome to another video of FX series in Maya. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a portal effect using particle system in Maya. Now, before we start with the buttons and the menus, so on and so forth, let's establish the style that we're going for. Now, I've got some reference images, and they are from Marvel movies. So this is one type of portal where the thickness is, not that thick, and the floating particles don't have enough initial velocity. So basically they are floating particles and not necessarily get affected by the movement of the actual portal itself. Look at the size and the density of each particle and look how thick the main portal effect is. Now compare this to this image where we have more particles. They're getting or inheriting the velocity of the main portal, and as a result of that, with the help of motion blur, we get longer streaks per particle. So it's a different look. Now look at this one right here, where we have some sort of a middle ground where we do have particles with inherent velocity, but also we get some floating particles around it as well. So before you do anything else, really think about what type of look you would like to achieve. And obviously in this tutorial, we cannot achieve all of these looks. We are going to go with a very specific look. But this method that I'm about to show you allows you to really change from one type to another and achieve the look that you have in mind. Just as a bonus, I have this article as well. Well, it's not my article. I found it online. It's from Art of FX website. I put the link in the description below for you guys to have a read at. But it actually goes through the process that Rise Visual Effects, Method Studios, and Luma collaborated to create some of the effects in this particular movie. And right at the end, it talks about the number of passes, for example, the position pass and the dirt pass and the actual particle pass. So, a lot of information is out there, and to create this effect, you kind of need to do a little bit of research on the style, what the project brief asks you to do, and only then put things into practice. Now into Maya, I have 24 frames per second as my playback speed. I have about 300, well not about, but exactly 300 frames in my scene. And what I just created right before recording this video is just a normal circle. You can go to curve and create one. Again, things to be mindful of is the scene size and how big your scene is. And one thing you can do to help is to go to heads-up display, and I probably go and hide object details and enable particle count instead. So just to be mindful of how many particles I'm emitting from the source. Now you may think that because we have a curve here, and we actually can, I'm going to switch to effects menu set. There's one way of doing this, and it's very common, and is to use in particle menu and to go to emit from object, or emit from object if you want to use end particle. And from here we can have access to omnidirectional surface and curve, which we have here in the scene. That's one way of doing this. I found that controlling the behavior of this method can take longer than the method that I'm about to show you, and that's why I prefer the latter. Now, the method that I would like to use is through effects menu, which is probably one of the oldest menus in Maya. But while some of these icons are not as efficient as possible considering today's technology, we still use flow quite a fair bit. So with your curve selected, if you go to flow and create curve flow, you can see right off the bat we have a very comprehensive setup with just a single click. So what does this setup do? If I just collapse some of these attributes and group nodes, you can see we already have a particle node or particle legacy system with its emitter, and they all link to the curve that I nominated. And we already establish or have the correct flow. As a matter of fact, if I just play without changing anything, we can see that the particles have the correct movement. So they go from each one of these spheres, or should I say curves, and they follow the direction of my path, the one that I nominated, using these locators. So I'm not going to talk about the setup and how it's created. Basically, it's a combination of point constraint and tangent constraint that forces the particles to follow a specific path. But since it's already ready to go for us, we really don't need to make any changes in here. We did talk about particle setup and main attributes in the past. And if you press Ctrl A to go to attribute editor, you may say, all right, let's increase the rate, the number of particles per second, because this is not gonna look good. You know, we don't have enough particle. But surprisingly, everything is yellow. Now, every time you get a yellow channel, it means that it's connected to another node behind the scene using connection editor. So one way is just to find out what parent attribute this has been linked to and just disconnect it. Bit of a headache. Or we may want to investigate more and see if we have an easier option to work with. Well, for this particular setup, everything is connected to the group node, surprisingly. So if I click on it and go to the channel box, look at that. Everything is ready to go for us. As a matter of fact, we have emission rate, and I can just go from, I don't know, 50 to a really large amount, 3000, and play, and all of a sudden we get more particles. So this setup really helps us to be more efficient and be very quick at what we do. So since we have this, we can play around with some other areas. So for example, lifespan of 5 seconds is pretty long, so it takes 5 seconds for the particle to reach full circle. I'll probably go and reduce it to something like 1.5, so we get a much quicker turnaround for particles. So it takes only 1.5 seconds for the whole loop to take place. You can even go faster and do just that in 1 second. That's great. We have some attributes to change goal weight. We can actually display the thickness and see how this works behind the screen or behind the scene. We can display all circles, and they're accessible via here. We can display sub-segments, which they're a bunch of locators. But really, we don't need to worry about any of them. You can even turn off the entire visibility of particles and the setup with it, which we really don't need to do that. Now, right off the bat, one change I would like to make, and again, this is just a preference. If you dislike this step, you can just improvise and use your own reference for it. I personally think that this line is a bit thick. So to change that, you can go to circles and flow scalable circles, and you can see how nice that is that Maya actually names everything properly, so it's really easy to find. I go to control circle, and I've got 6 of them. And I'm going to go and reduce its scale. And it says scale X, but Y and Z have been connected to channel X via node editor. So it's going to be proportionate. I'm going to reduce that to 0.6. And you can't select all of them and do it in one go, unfortunately, because individual circles have constraints attached to them. And you have to conduct this method one by one. If you would like to get more circles, you can always go to Effect, Flow, and then in the option box you can increase number of subsegments and control segments if you want. But for this effect, I think the default value works just fine. Now that's that, so I'm going to close this and click on the actual particle system and Control A to go to its shape node. While we can't change some of these attributes through the actual particle shape node, well, because we did it via the group node, we still have access to quite a fair bit of attributes here. For example, while lifespan is locked, I still can switch to random and give it a tad of randomness. Well, I think I prefer 1.5 as my default value, and then I go to attribute editor and make this a random range and give it probably 0.5 randomness. So this allows particles not to die at the same time, you know, half a second before and after this lifespan it can take place. It gives just a tad of randomness, and you can see how this line is now thinner. And then I go to particle render type. Point is just ugly in my opinion, so I'm just going to switch to streak. And if you want to tweak the settings for the streak, the settings won't just come up by selecting the type. You have to click on current render type, and then you see the attributes for that render type. Now in here you can just change the length of each tail. You can fade the tail, which 0 is actually doing it. If you don't want any fade at the bottom of each line, you can just set it to 1, which I think wouldn't be a wise move. You can actually thicken every single particle point. Different look, really. There's nothing to it. But more importantly, I would like to change the color of them in here. Now, there are many ways of doing this. The simplest way possible is to click on the color and go particle per object. So if I go add, then I get a simple RGB value that I can change. So I'm just going to oversaturate R, add a little bit of a green, and probably mix it with the dash of blue to get it like an overheated sort of look to it. And that should really do it for us. You can even go to 5 and 2 and get like a yellowish look to the whole thing. Now if I rewind and play, so far so good. So that's the base of our particle system, but that's not enough, because if you remember the references we shown, yes, we do have a thickness and a line for each portal, but also we have some floating particles that usually get emitted from the main portal. So we need to create that as well. While there are many methods available to create that secondary action, including post-production work, I think it's relatively easy to create that effect inside Maya and just blend everything together in one scene. So the way to do that is to actually emit a secondary layer of particle from our particle system. So if you remember, one option we have in particle is always to emit from any object. Well, this particle system is a particle object. That's the terminology that Autodesk even uses. So we can, with the particle selected, we can go to emit from object, we'll look at the option box. I'm just going to call this probably tails, particles. I'm going to use Omni for now and go create. Now, if I rewind, we emit normal particle system from the original particle system. That's great. It's exactly what we were hoping to have. One thing that I noticed is just too many particles we have in here. Now you can see that the emission for the new particle system is under the old particle system. Make sure that you understand how the hierarchy works. This is the emission for the old particle system, which is not parented to the original particle system. The new particle system has got the emission inside the old particle system. Hopefully it makes sense, because I feel like I'm even confusing myself with this. So let's go ahead and reduce the counts, because right now I think what we have is just way too much. Maybe I'm going to go with 10, from 100 to 10. That's better. That's easier to manage and easy to control. But the problem is first of all, they're not having the exact same color. The shape of it is incorrect. And more importantly, they're just emitting from the particle and they completely disregard the direction of the particle. So let's tackle those problems one by one. So I'm going to go to the new particle system, the one that I just created. And I'm going to start from the top. Now, we talked about this attribute conserve that sucks the energy out of the particle system. Usually a number of 1 is just too much. I'm going to reduce this to probably 0.98. I'm moving down to lifespan, which is a must when we want to tweak our particle system. So I'm going to give this a lifespan of 2. So each particle will live for 2 seconds and may die half a second before and after they're born. Adds a bit of randomness to it. Just like the initial particle system, we are going to give this streak look. And if I click on the current render type, I can change a few things. So line width, I'll set it to, or keep the default value. Normal direction, I'll keep the default value. Tail fade, I want this to fade, so I'm not going to change that. Tail size, I'm going to set it to 2. Now we need to add color as well, so I'm going to use the same trick per object, and that gives me RGB value to play with. I probably need to get help from the original particle system. It was 5 to 0.9, and I tend to kind of keep the same value. Of course, if your project brief or the project that you're working, if that allows you to change the color, by all means you can do that. None of these options are compulsory. It's just based on your creative decisions. So you can see it creates something, it looks like a particle, but again, one thing that annoys me a little bit is they're not respecting the original particle system. Now, probably the first thing that you may think about is, well, can we just go to fields? We have fields and solvers, something like drag, radial, gravity, even turbulence. Can we use them to direct the particles? Yes, we're eventually going to get help from them, but none of those attributes are going to, or none of those force fields are going to help us to achieve the portal look where the secondary layer of particles actually follow the first layer of particles. There's only one way is out there or available to us that we can achieve that type of behavior, and that attribute is inside the secondary particle system. And that attribute is usually overlooked, and that is called inherit factor. Inherit factor is great for exactly this scenario where we have two particle objects, and we would like one to respect the other. We use this attribute, but just keep that in mind that this value is very, very sensitive. So probably something like 0.1 would be a good starting point and probably enough. Now you can see that they're actually following the rotation of the main particle system. You know, you can go really crazy with that and actually create some really cool effects. So if I don't know, do that, put something like, I don't know, 4, you can see we're getting really funky results. And I don't know, maybe that's the look that you're looking for. But for now, we would like to sort of follow the creative setup or brief that we already have. So I think that type of look should give us a really good starting point. We're certainly making progress. Now, another change I would like to make is I would like to make these particle points to gradually fade out to full transparent. So I'm not sure if you have noticed, but if you even set the lifespan, they just disappear after 2 seconds. They're not going to gradually die or fade out, which is normally what you see in these type of effects. But the good news is you can achieve that in Maya too. So if I scroll down, we have an attribute called opacity, and that creates opacity per particle. Right now, we don't have it in here. So when we click on that, we can have add per particle attribute. And if we add that, all of a sudden, we get the opacity channel we need per particle attribute. I'm gonna right click and create a ramp. And as soon as I do that, we get a really nice gradual fall off around our particle setup. Now you can edit this ramp. You can right click on it and go edit ramp. Now look what happens when I'm going to switch this to smooth. Look what happens when I actually change these sliders. We're getting more or less particles. As a matter of fact, if I bring those two to the both extreme ends, only by using this slider, I can change the effect. So I can even create more grayish look to create a nice transition. But I honestly think what I have will suffice. Again, you don't need to follow this. You can even click on this little guy, bring this ramp and just add, you know, your rendition or your version of this into this and make it a really, you customize the shape of it if you want. So let's call this part done and let's bring some secondary effects to kind of jazz up the look of the final result. So to do that, I need to use force fields. So one force field that comes to mind with the secondary layer of particles selected is of course turbulence. We never want to have everything neat and clean. So I'm going to click on the option box and probably reset the settings. Call this force field turb. I'll start with a good degree of magnitude, a strong force field that kind of forces each point to move a little bit to left and right. As usual, we zero out attenuation, and we do talk about those attributes in our fire tutorial. Click on the top up banner if you haven't watched that. I'm going to frequency and increase frequency to get a much nicer pattern. And of course, I would like to get a little bit of noise, and the default value should work for us just fine. I'll go create, and I also change the background. It helps me to see things better. And look at that. There's so many ways that you can go about this to achieve a slightly different look. As a matter of fact, I have done a few versions, a few different looks for the portal, just to show you how diverse yet sturdy this method is. With only a few clicks, you can achieve a completely different look and make the end result closer to what you're looking for. Now, I can easily bring my force field and change a few attributes to get a completely different results. For example, I can easily reduce this magnitude to something like 5, increase the frequency instead. I can go to particle system itself and make some changes here. For example, I can make these particles to live longer. I can actually reduce the amount of conserve to something like 0.9, and again that creates a really interesting effect for me. I can even go and change the inherit factor to a different value, and you can see how simple this is to go through all of these very simple changes that you can make to create a different effect. I can even increase the tail size to something like 4 and instantly look how different the result will look like. Probably I'm going to increase this value, have more velocity, and let's play. So you can see we're getting a more refined, grainy look, and that is a completely different look, yet something that you may find use for it. Now, I can easily change this really quick. I can use a higher conserve value, so the particles move or spin quicker, and then increase the inherit velocity factor, and even increase more of the tail size. I can even go to this lifespan random and zero it out and look at the result. This gives you a completely different look, right? So based on what you want and based on what you would like to have, there are so many controls, so many options available to achieve different looks. Now, let's talk about rendering. There are two types of rendering this particle system, and it really comes down to how you would like this to be composited. If this is part of an existing scene and you have Arnold or RenderMan or V-Ray shaders already in your scene, and you would like this particle setup to have those materials, then you need to go to color, to shader, and assign a standard shader or a RenderMan shader, or use the default shader for that particular renderer. Now that requires you to make certain changes. For starters, you cannot use streak anymore, because streak is only renderable by native viewport renderer, not the proper engine renderer. So you have to use probably sphere, and then change the size or radius of this sphere, and then you assign motion blur to it. So I'm going to reduce this to something like 0.05, something really tiny, and then you give this a motion blur, and that motion blur will create that tail that we used in the attribute. So the tail size should be controlled by motion blur. Now let's say you don't want to use this method. You still want to use the method that we already had. In this case, you can go to render settings, and instead of picking Arnold V-Ray RenderMan renderer, you use Maya hardware renderer. And I know it sounds basic, but it does a beautiful job. The only thing is you have to have that as a pass. Well, you can have that as PNG or EXR, and that comes with transparency or alpha channel, and you can just have it on a layer and composite it back to your scene using compositing packages like Fusion or Nuke. So the rest is pretty similar. You can have a frame range, set up your camera, set up your resolution, and in Maya hardware you can even assign motion blur to it and increase anti-aliasing samples from 8 to 16. Believe it or not, you're going to get a really good result out of this very, very fast. So 400 frames may take few minutes on a mediocre machine. Let's have a look at a few variations that I came up with in a very short span of time. This is one example with a slight difference in color, but exactly the same method. Here's another example where I used longer streaks, more particles, and I used an interesting camera angle, and it's like you've been sucked in to the portal. You know, just a completely different look, but exactly the same method. And just here's another variation, a much lighter, smoother effect using the exact same method. So I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope you use this for your own use. Let me know what you think. If you have any suggestions, I'm more than happy to look into it. Thank you very much, and see you in the next video.